So welcome guys. Today we'll be doing this passage on battling implicit bias, and as you can see the author here is against training against implicit bias. So we'll be going through a detailed explanation of what implicit bias is, how training can be inefficient, and what generates implicit bias. So let's move to the first paragraph. On a Thursday afternoon in April 2018, in a Starbucks in downtown Philadelphia, police handcuffed two African American entrepreneurs, Rashon Nelson and Dante Robinson. A manager had reported them for waiting inside the coffee house while not having purchased anything. About a month later, on 29th May, Starbucks closed its 8,000 stores nationwide at a cost of about estimated $16.7 million in sales, so that its 175,000 employees across the US could participate in 4-hour implicit bias training session that day. So this shows an effect of what the behavior motivated by implicit bias can cause, like the effects the implicit bias can cause and what the bigger corporations are doing to tackle it, right? So training against implicit bias seems to be the way they are going, but the author is going to explain on it. Implicit bias once was jargon that academic psychologists used to refer to people's automatically activated thoughts and feelings towards a certain group rather than others. Now it's a buzzword that regularly appears in news articles and occasionally presidential debates. Implicit bias stand in contrast to this explicit biases, people's conscious or self-reported thoughts and feeling towards certain groups over others, such as when people think overtly voice dislike towards Asian people. Implicit biases are more subtle. You can think of them as tiny stories that flicker in our minds when we see people. A pharmacy employee may be seen as a black woman crouching on the floor and zipping up a bag and immediately thinks she's attempting to steal. And this incident actually happened. It was mentioned in a drug mart in Toronto. On a border, patrol officer might enforce an identity check upon black citizens thinking they pose a threat, as happened in Netherlands in 2018. So many of these incidents have occurred, and what do they mean? So implicit biases, according to the author, are automatic thoughts we have toward a certain group. So this can be any group, right, based on any distinctions like race or any other genders, etc. And these have become famous as a buzzwords in today's trending social media and other forms of media. A great example of this would be the, as it's given, the bias against black people. So we get into the definition of what implicit biases are, and as we move along, the concept of implicit bias has captivated social psychologists for decades because it answers a perennial question: why is that? Why why most people espouse diversity but they still discriminate? So we can see the two sides people have during very hard decisions like this. Like, people say that they are not discriminating towards black people or any other group, not just black people here, but they still have that innate idea that whenever they see some situation and they think they have bias towards their behaviors, right? So why is that? They want equality. They behave in ways that favor some group over others. So there are studies that also show that while participants self-report relatively neutral explicit bias towards black people, they still hold that anti-black implicit bias. Uh, this can substantially influence thoughts and behaviors even among well-meaning people. So we don't know that. We are aware of this bias that we have towards people, but we do not know the effects that these biases can cause in our actions or the behaviors towards them, right? So we don't know the consequences. So this is another example again. For inserting names from minority job applicants receive fewer callbacks from jobs. So this is the dichotomy is shown in this passage, where people think they are very, I mean, they espouse equality and diversity, but they still discriminate in some form because of the biases they have. They mean well, but these behaviors or the small changes in behaviors can actually affect people and society at large, probably. So moving on to the next one. So implicit bias is a problem, and what do most organizations do to solve it? Is the implicit bias training, and this is the entire passage is what the entire passage is built on. So They presumably reduce discrimination. While the structure and content of these trainings can vary substantially, what typically happens is that in 1 or 2 hours, an instructor provides attendees with a primer on implicit biases, explaining, for instance, the theory and evidence and the concepts. We measure the implicit biases, reflect on the scores, and finally, the instructor briefs attendees on ways to mitigate these biases. These have been this is a huge industry. The trainings are a huge industry in McKinsey and Company, and training cost in US companies are 8 billion annually. So this is the this paragraph shows basically what the corporate sectors and the companies do to prevent this kind of, and I mean, implicit bias, right? So anti-bias trainings and diversity training are a huge part of their training curriculum or something. Yeah. So scores of criticisms around the states exist online. The passage itself may be a part of it, but I can give you my sense of why are they say ineffectual. I completed an unconscious bias training module as a part of work orientation from my alma mater. After spending about 30 minutes from watching 3 modules of content that were supposed to last 90 minutes, I was feeling the same way I did after going through workplace orientation module, bored, exasperated, like I had wasted my time on another checkbox exercise and diversity posturing activity. So, this paragraph starts the criticism about the states, how they are boring, ineffective, and the author gives his view on the test as well as he was made to take it. So yeah, this was just a small paragraph. The author himself is also an implicit bias researcher. So here's what the scientific literature says about these trainings: they don't work. So the scientific literature is against those training, but still we can see that these corporates are employing these methods to diversify their workforce and to remove these biases from the workplace. Let's see the meanings. The three main reasons are: first, the trainings conflate implicit biases with unconscious biases. The risk This risk delegitimizing discrimination altogether by attributing bias based behavior to the unconscious, which releases people from responsibility. Second, it's very difficult to change people's implicit biases, especially because social environments tends to reinforce them. And third, even if we could change people's implicit biases, it wouldn't necessarily change the discriminatory behaviors. Okay, so let's see what the three reasons why they are mostly ineffective, right? So the first is the trainings think that implicit bias is some kind of unconscious bias, and this delegitimizes the discrimination that is. This means that if you are not conscious about something, it doesn't mean that you are at fault. It does not hold you accountable for that bias you have, right? So this is the first thing get wrong. And second thing, it's very difficult to change implicit biases because it is not entirely an individual force at work here. Your social experiences, the people around you, the things going on around you can influence you very heavily. So fixing it is very difficult. I think the author will say it later on. And third, if even if we could change it, it wouldn't change the discriminatory behaviors, because whatever your action may be, whatever your thinking may be, the context and what goes on around you depends hugely. I mean, matters hugely in whatever you do. So it wouldn't necessarily change the behaviors. Let's move on to the next paragraph. Here's where I land. While training at best can help raise awareness of inequality, they should not take precedence over meaningful courses of action, such as policy changes that are more time intensive and costly but provide lasting changes. If organizations want meaningful societal changes on discrimination, they should shift our focus away from implicit biases and towards changing systems that perpetuate biased behavior. So this is what's constructive from his criticism in the earlier paragraph. So this test may help raising awareness about inequality, but not what actually implicit biases are. We should take, or the corporate entity should take meaningful actions to change policies that change behavior in their workplace, right? Because you are more influenced by the behaviors of other people or the society around you. That's how these biases get created or triggered. These actions are cue cards for these biases to show up, right? So if policies prevent those behaviors or structurize those behaviors and events, we can maintain a better biasless environment. So I think this is what the author is trying to say through in this paragraph. Like we should focus away from implicit biasing and make better systems altogether. Okay, so moving on to the next chapter. To understand all of this, it's important to know how the common measurement tool for implicit biases, the IAT, works. So the author is again talking about a new tool that is used to measure implicit biases, the IAT. The easiest way to understand what the test entails is to do one. The standard version measuring racial biases is publicly available through the website Project Implicit, a domain that houses IITs for various topics. Otherwise, here's a quick rundown. The IIT flashes on your screen two kinds of stimuli, faces either of black people or white people, and words either good or bad. In some trials, you are then asked to press E on your keyboard if there is a black face or bad word is shown, and I if there is a white face or good word is shown. So the user here talks about the IIT test, which is available on this Project Implicit website, or and in the next part he starts giving the details about what the test entails, right? So how the test judges your implicit biases. So so we continue with the description here. uh, Here's where it gets tricky. What associated with key mixes up as you progress. The key mixes up as you progress. If in earlier trials E means black or bad, it can now mean black or good. So it changes as we go on. So let's say that you are now slower to press E when it pairs black with good than when it pairs black with bad. This could suggest that you hold more negative implicit biases towards black people compared to white. So the change in your probable response time with when the buttons are changed up as we move on, they judge various kinds of implicit biases we hold towards certain groups, in this case as black people. So this is how the author conveys how the test works and how they test on you on if implicit biases exist or not. At the end of the test, people receive their IIT test score, which tells them which group they have an automatic preference for. This is the part that can incite shock and horror, because people may self-report themselves to be very equal. I mean, they think very equally of others, and they may hold no, I mean, prejudices against other race, right? But the test score can be against what they think, like can bring up new stuff. They think they are all equal, but but users may not know about such stuff, right? So this is where the IIT score may incite shock or horror. So while they thought they preached equality, they were subconsciously biased the entire time. So the new information can come up which they haven't known before. So what some people get wrong though is an automatic preference is not same as an unconscious bias. So repeating the same stuff here, unconscious presumes that you are not aware of it, and thus you are not accountable for that bias that you have. So like it's nothing wrong with it. Like unconscious means there is nothing wrong with it, and this is something you can't control, right? But we need to take account. We need to hold ourselves accountable for these implicit biases, because these behaviors, this kind of behavior may have greater impact. Like we don't know what the consequences can be, right? Like as portrayed in the first few paragraphs. So we need to take care of those. So author compares like it's like an habit, it's a nail biting. You've associated stress with nail biting so strongly that it doesn't take long for stress to trigger you to bite your nails. So this is an example, or rather an analogy to show how this works, right? Uh, Next, numerous studies have shown that people can be aware of implicit biases. One 2014 study by the psychologist Adam Hahn and his colleagues show that people can generally predict their IIT scores with high degree of accuracy. They found an average correlation of R equals to 0.65 between participants' prediction of their scores and their actual IIT scores. A correlation that is typically considered large in psychological research. For instance, the heritability of IQ and education are also around that mark. If it were the case that people generally aren't aware, they wouldn't be able to predict their IIT performance. And so, IIT measures implicit biases because these are likely not unconscious. So this is kind of an evidence towards the theory that the author is stating. So implicit biases doesn't mean that they are unconscious, right? People are aware of it. So this study here shows that they can easily predict what the scores are gonna be. There's a high relation between what they predict and what they actually get. So this shows that it is not unconscious, something that is not unconscious. Unfortunately, this misunderstanding remains widespread. The misunderstanding that implicit biases are unconscious biases remains widespread. For instance, an article by Christine Rowe on BBC in 2021 uses implicit biases and unconscious biases synonymously. As does an article here as well, Office of Diversity and Outreach at UC, University of California. An article by David Robson in The Guardian in 2021, and he lists on articles and places where they have been used synonymously. And this misunderstanding is still going on, as the author points out. So, to be clear, unconscious bias may exist, and just because someone might be aware of their implicit bias doesn't mean they're conscious of their effects of their bias on other people, or that we can effectively control them. So, uh, unconscious bias may exist, and so may implicit biases, right? So, but the thing is, we can't understand what the effect of our behavior may have on other people or the society at large. So we are not conscious of the effects, so we may also have problems in controlling them, right? So this is the main thing that we have to look at: the effects, the behaviors that are guided by these implicit biases. But here's why it's not important to conflate implicit bias and unconscious bias. Claiming that discrimination arises from the unconscious psychologizes it, presents discrimination as an unintentional act rather than a preventable consequence, and thereby enables people to feel less morally culpable for discriminating. The thing, it is repeated what we just learned few paras ago. Like, we need to hold ourselves accountable. This is not something that's unconscious. If it's unconscious, we can't control it, and hence we are not culpable for discriminating or doing such stuff, right? We need to hold ourselves accountable. One study from 2019 demonstrates this experimentally. The social psychologist Natalie Dowmeyer, not very good with names, and her colleagues at the Yale showed participants a fabricated article in which both Democratic and Republican doctors demonstrated bias towards patients based on their political ideology, where they engaged in somewhat politicized health behaviors. In one condition, that the doctors were somewhat aware that they were treating patients differently. However, in the other condition, they defined bias as unconscious bias. So, in one case, they knew that the doctors were engaging in some kind of controversial health behaviors, like this gun or marijuana use, and in one cases they were aware of what they are doing, and in another case they weren't. So it was unconscious, and the people like had more favorable or less culpable uh, less culpable actions or thoughts towards those who were unconsciously doing such stuff, right? Because unconsciously doing means you aren't aware of what harm you're doing, and you cannot hold them accountable for their, like, it's an honest mistake basically. But in this case, they were knew what they were doing, and they were aware of the harmful effect that they could have caused on the patient, right? So this study shows the difference in the mindset towards what is unconscious mistake and what is not. So we need to hold ourselves accountable and not think implicit biases as something unconscious. So we go on towards the results. What did they find? When the doctors were described as having no conscious knowledge of unfair treatment, participants rated them as needing to be less accountable and less deserving of punishment. So what I just said, compared with when the doctor's behavior was ascribed to be conscious bias. So why the difference? Awareness signifies intentionality. So if you are aware of something, that means you are intentionally doing something, and if you are intentionally doing something wrong, that means you are trying to cause harm to the patient, and that is like morally wrong for you. But if you are not aware of something, that means it was an honest mistake, and you can be forgiven for the lack of insight. If diversity practitioners perpetuate this notion that unconscious bias underlies daily acts of discrimination, they could reduce accountability towards perpetrators and prevent behavioral change. So we cannot say that again implicit biases are unconscious, right? So we have to be accountable again, and terming implicit bias as unconscious bias can reduce the effects that like the effects of this kind of behavior have on the society at large or to people we know around us. So yeah, there should be a difference between two and they shouldn't be used synonymously. Yeah. Okay, so you may think from here that I'm conscious about my implicit biases and hence I can control them, right? So that's not the case as we can gonna see in this paragraph. Even when implicit bias is conscious, it is notoriously hard to change. One study tested 9 implicit bias interventions previously shown to reduce implicit biases and found that these changes subsided after several hours or at best days. That because while biases might be an individual characteristic, they require people, social environment, work, family, etc. to make them accessible, as the social psychologist Keith Payne argues in The Bias of the Crowds. The environment does not change, the bias will return. So, implicit bias, although being conscious, you cannot readily change them because they are hard to change, because they are sustained by the society around us. Like everything you do, everything, every people you interact with, everything controls what you do as well, right? It makes a mark on your consciousness and like creates these biases, creates these cues to turn like change your behaviors. So it is not something you can't you can consciously change, like I'm gonna change it today. It does not happen like that. So to support this view, consider the fact that IITs generally measure individuals' implicit biases unreliably. That means the score you receive today may change tomorrow and any other time. So these are known as, this is termed as noisy measures because these are not very reliable as well, reliable, right? So your scores can fluctuate depending on context, like your mental state. Like for example, a given example is given: if you watched Barbie before the IIT, you might respond positively to a woman in gender science IIT. So changing people to shift biases may be if it is a kind of a futile exercise because readily it cannot be done. So in this case we need to take care of not just the not the consciousness that guiding it, but the social interactions that may create the consciousness itself, right? So we kind of, it may seem like we are treating the symptoms, not the disease, but I think that's what the author is hinting at. It is one thing to know whether the IIT measures implicit biases, but how, if at all, do these biases relate to behavior? This question has been studied thoroughly with 4 meta-analyses, synthesizing the findings of hundreds of studies that largely use the IIT. They converge on a common finding: why implicit biases do demonstrate a reliable correlation with individual behavior. This correlation is generally weak. That why Project Implicit warns participants against using their IIT scores to diagnose anything meaningful about themselves. So this talks about studies about how implicit biases may relate to behavior. How do they change your behavior? So there have been a lot of studies with the IIT scores and behaviors, and the correlation between them is very weak. So it may not change your behavior. That's what the author is saying. And the project implicit also warns us against diagnosing ourselves of biases and through our behaviors and all those stuff. On the other hand, in line with the bias of crowds model, aggregating the scores of many people taking the IIT test at once can help us predict behavior. The IIT poorly predicts the behavior of one person, but what about taking the average IIT scores of an entire city or state or correlating with outcomes? So the author is trying to move into a more generalized group of people rather than an individual, right? Because there was no result in case of individual and it was very noisy and unreliable. One study by the social psychologist Eric Heyman and his colleagues provided some insight. They studied the implicit biases of more than 2 million residents across US within their metro areas, and also drew from metro area socio-demographic data using crowdsourced and fact-checked databases for measures like overall wealth, unemployment rate, and crime levels. They found that out of 14 variables, only one, greater anti-black implicit bias, has been among white residents of a certain metro areas, significantly correlated with greater use of lethal force against black people relative to the base rates of that metro area. For instance, metro areas in Wisconsin held higher anti-black implicit bias on average, which correlated with the higher use of lethal violence against black people in that area. These findings, in line with the bias of the crowds model, highlight that whether implicit biases are strongly associated with individual level behavior, implicit biases at a regional level can be strongly associated with regional level behavioral outcomes, possibly because implicit biases reflect systematic rather than personal differences. So, this talks about a study where the implicit biases do not move a certain person into action, right? They do not directly motivate a certain person into action, just so it does not work at the individual level. But when it was surveyed at certain places or certain localities, the group a systematic implicit bias of an entire system is what like what motivated their groups to uh, engage in crimes or engage in actions that increase the crime statistics in those places, right? So it is not, so these are strongly associated with individual level behavior but at a regional level. So this is what the study found. Note, however, that most studies on the relationship between implicit biases and behavior, including the study by Heyman and colleagues, are correlational. Even if we could change people's implicit biases, would they lead to a change in levels of discrimination? In other words, let's say implicit bias training successfully reduced individual police officers' biases against black people. Would they would that reduction in bias translate to them discriminating against black people less often? So the author is again like questioning the legitimacy of like would changing implicit biases or reducing the implicit biases change behavior? Are those training important? So again, all these questions are brought up. The author talks out about another meta-analysis that looks at 63 randomized experiments that used an IAT and a behavioral measure. So the result was that the same result that we talk about, like at individual level, changing a person's mind does not change their behavior, and yeah, so changing someone's mind against those implicit biases may not be something that is very fruitful in changing their behaviors in an organization or something. These findings should strike us as surprising given the gap between attitudes and behavior that have been documented again and again. Usually follows a principle of correspondence. The extent to which an attitude predicts behavior usually depends on how well the attitude matches the behavior. So another example is given how like an attitude matches a behavior, right? Like what the attitude shows and what the behavior is conveyed to. For example, how do you feel about registering yourself as an organ donor? In this case, the responses are more uh, positive in nature than the question in general. How do you feel about organ donation? So uh, when you individualize someone or uh, talk about them directly, the results are much better than in case in a general situation, right? So let's see it. The attitude specific to an organ donor registration are better predictors of registration behavior than general attitude. Like feel people don't feel like they need to give their own opinion unless they are asked about themselves, right? So when there is a general question floated in their direction, they can like tell something they think they believe in rather than they something actually believe in. So IITs usually measure implicit biases towards broad groups like black people in comparison with white people without more information about what they're doing or where they are. So yeah, that's it. And furthermore, the attitudes interact with context to predict behavior. Most of us demonstrate a positive attitude towards exercise, for example, but that does not mean we will go to the gym in the weekend, right? We don't feel motivated. The gym might be closed or the weather rainy. Like we may think that we want to do something or have some kind of idea about something, but we may not always do it, right? Because there's a difference between what we think we do and what we actually do. In the same way, someone might show a negative implicit bias towards Asian people, but that does not mean they behave negatively towards them. They talks about another study that where like His professor Richard Lapierre at the Stanford University. They drove through the US with Chinese couple and they stopped at more than 250 restaurants and were refused service only once. But several months later, the restaurants were surveyed, the owners were surveyed, and they said that they would not serve Chinese people. But in actuality, they were served. So there is a difference between what they think they would do, but what they actually did. Okay, so move on to the next chapter. Given all this, the question that emerges is what can we really do? Here's what we don't need more implicit bias trainings. In fact, as an implicit bias researcher, I think that organizations should decentralize or do away with the concept of implicit biases entirely. Implicit biases as an empirical concept are interesting and potentially valuable, but as a tool for diversity, equality, and inclusion, it just confuses people and distracts from the actual problem. Okay, so what the author is again taking a negative stance on the implicit bias trainings. He thinks that they do not actually change the behaviors, and as per the given paragraphs ahead, I mean before, and so and he also thinks we should not concern ourselves with the concept of implicit biases, right? We should concern ourselves about how we behave. We should make changes, policies to create a structure that prevents the behaviors or the unequal behaviors that we may show, rather than directly thinking about the concept itself. So let's move ahead. The reason why these trainings exist is because they are cheap, easily scalable solutions from an optics standpoint, allowing organizations to prop up an image that they care about DEI when the actions accompanying the important values are often vacuous. It's ironic, isn't it? The very notion of implicit bias stands on the discrepancy between values and actions, but the concept just perpetuates this problem. Before organizations preach the dangers of implicit biases, they should look at their hiring system, policies, practices that actually discriminate. Okay, so the author explains why he does not think the trainings are good enough, because they are simple solutions to seem very caring for the entities, right? They try to create an image of themselves where they show that they care about people, they all the they do not they care about equality and all these values, the DEI values, but it actually is for a cover for them to keep on doing what they do behind the scenes, like keep on not fixing their policies, fixing their systems, like actually prevent discrimination in various of their processes like hiring systems and etc., where they discriminates against minorities. So this is something that they do instead of actually taking steps towards it. Here's what I think. Let's stop caring so much about how people think and focus more on how people and companies behave. I'm partly inspired by the paper Stuck on Intergroup Attitudes, the need to shift gears to change intergroup behaviors, by the psychologist Marcus Brauer. It argues that researchers and practitioners, rather than relying on interventions that change people's attitudes, should focus on interventions that directly target behavior. Okay, so expanding on that idea that we shouldn't talk about or do anything about why we show these behaviors, like we should directly target these behaviors and prevent them from happening. So, for instance, rather than asking a hiring manager to participate in a workshop to change their attitude towards women applicants, an organization could instead enforce hiring criteria prior to seeing an applicant pool to reduce the biasing effect of applicants' gender. So, yeah, same thing, no workshops, less targeting what we can do, like targeting what we can do, like limiting what we can do to increase these problems of discrimination and inequality, right? Like we do not target the biases or try to control them, we try to control the behaviors. Research shows that this approach has already been used successfully because biases don't come from a vacuum, they're triggered by certain cues. Yeah, so some social actions that you may partake in with your colleagues, friends, family, they may trigger these certain cues, like for example this examples like color of someone's skin, their accent, the clothes. So if we hide biasing information when it matters, we could also mitigate the effects of bias. Like if we control, like as it was mentioned before, social cues can like create or increase implicit biases, right? So we, if we control or create policies to control these social conditions, we can actually create actually control implicit biases, like through themselves, right? So this is not the case that I mentioned, that treating the symptoms rather than the disease, but in this case the symptoms are what causes the disease. So it's a different kind of situation here. Using hiring criteria is an obvious example, but behavioral science research reveals other creative ways to attenuate discrimination from top down rather than bottom up. For instance, besides concealing information, organizations can restructure the way they present choices to employees. In business, one common reason we don't see as many women in the leadership positions because it requires them to self promote and self nominate. Yet, women who assert themselves can incur backlash for behaving in a counter stereotypical way, which causes them to step back from competition. Here's what organizations can push back: by leveraging on behavioral economics concept known as defaults. They can shift to the default model. So nominating oneself is a decision that women need to actively opt out from. So if they don't opt out, they get an opportunity to get promoted. So this is change in how we do things to prevent this inequality and discriminations, right? The example here is that women sometimes get backlash for like promoting themselves in workplaces to managerial or leadership roles, but we can change the backlash that they receive by changing the process as a whole, right? So if we make the system like this, that everyone is like everyone can opt, everyone is all automatically or by default can get promoted or is in the selection to get promoted, right? And to not get promoted, you need to opt out from the process. So this removes the like the self promotion part from the entire system, right? So they do not get do not incur the backlash from the society or their colleagues or whatever. So this is a change in the structure that can help reducing inequality. The management professor Joyce He at the University of California, Los Angeles, and her colleagues demonstrated the efficacy of this intervention in the study in 2021. So it moves on about the study. On the recruitment platform Upwork, they recruited 477 freelancers. One point, they gave the freelancers the ability to choose between two tasks. So there are two tasks. One is very high paying, and the second one is and the first one was very low paying but more secure data scraping task. The freelancers had to compete with other workers for the advanced task, and if they didn't win, they risked not earning any money at all. So what they did was they did two scenarios where the first one was they need to opt in for the condition that they want to compete with other freelancers, and the second one was they need to opt out that they do not want to compete and go into the first data scraping task. So obviously the opt out had more like the people did not opt out as much. They wanted to opt in the first case. This shows that the default scenario helps people to come forward more without thinking about backlash, without thinking about anything else, right? Like 57% of women versus 72% of men chose to compete. So the gender gap between men and women freelancers in the opt-in condition, whereas they did not find statistical significance in the opt-out condition. So you see that the opt-out condition like helped women come forward more towards the competitive side of things, right? They didn't feel like they would get backlash for staying wherever they are rather than promoting themselves towards that situation. To minimize biases and promote diversity and inclusion, we need to redesign biased processes to include more disadvantaged groups rather than attempt to change people's minds. So yeah, again the same thing. We don't need to change people's minds, but rather change how they can probably behave. Still, there are two caveats. One is that the structural behavioral interventions are considered relatively low hanging fruit compared to inclusive policies. Policies that mitigate unequal wages between men and women, they increase access to paid parental leave and all other stuff like those. tackling the root causes of discrimination rather than symptoms. Root causes of discrimination rather than symptoms. Furthermore, I don't think that implicit bias training is useless, because executed correctly, it can be an effective awareness building tool. And changing individual minds can catalyze structural changes, but I adamantly believe that this training should not exist until organizations try doing the structural work first. So yeah, there are some warnings that the author think are concerned about. Uh, the first one is that this like changing how behavior can happen sometimes may feel like treating the symptoms rather than the disease, right? So as I said, as I mentioned in the first part of the essay as well, that treating how you can behave can sometimes seem to be like changing the symptoms, or just treating the symptoms rather than changing what's going on in your mind. But there are things against that as mentioned in the paragraphs. And second word, the implicit bias trainings are not useless, completely useless. They may help building awareness about the inequality or discrimination that goes on, and changing someone's mind can be useful, but they should not come first of promoting or making like better policies that help actually remove this inequality and discrimination. So the structure and the policies should come first before these workshops and trainings and all. And here's another good thing about changing social structures: they can have impact on individual biases. For there's an example, like changing legislation can also change biases. Like one of my previous colleagues at McGill University, the intergroup relations researcher Eugene Ofosu, asked whether same-sex marriage legalization was associated with reduced anti-gay implicit biases across US. His team studied US IIT scores between 2005 and 2016, and what they found was striking. While the implicit anti-gay bias for each state on average decreased at a steady rate for same-sex marriage legislation, these biases decreased at a sharper rate following the legislation. And even after controlling the demographic variables such as age and gender, the state level factors such as education and income. So that's the thing. If you can limit behavior of people through policies, laws, legislation in this case, like the idea or the thinking of the people regarding those topics will definitely change. So there's an impact on the individual's bias based on the changing social structures. So as the author mentioned before, changing like the interacting with the society of the people around us are what strengthens these biases among us, right? So changing those behaviors in the social level can also change or reduce those implicit biases within us, as is the case in this example here. So legislation and policy don't just tell us what to do, but what to think. Yeah, so all of that summed up in one line. They signal our social norms, unwritten rules, and define what acceptable and appropriate. They undergird our attitude. Other studies also reinforce this point at an organizational level. Women working for companies perceived to have more gender inclusive policies report more supportive interaction with their male colleagues, lower levels of workplace burnout, and a greater commitment to the organization. So yeah, this like changing how we think, changing how we do may also change how we look at things in this example here. So like we now move on to the concluding paragraph of the essay. Stop distributing implicit bias training as a cure all. We get it that it cannot solve anything at an individual level, or even like even if it does solve it at an individual level, it may again build up due to the societal experiences and all, and moreover it may not dictate our behavior, right? Stop with the meaningless virtue signaling. Stop selling this training under the guise of research. I get it, trainings are easy, they're cost effective, but one of solution do not work, and implicit bias is not really the problem. So we come down to the main thing, that implicit bias is not the problem. We need to limit behavior, and limiting behavior may change how we think, how the biases work, and may change the society. Bias systems and structures that allow for biased behavior are the real problem. Real DEI requires rebuilding bias system from the ground up. It takes time. It takes top down versus bottom up change. It requires real accountability and leadership. Don't ask how people can change their biases to get a diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think it's gonna be equality, right? Anyway, ask what organizations and institutions have done in their hiring systems, their DEI policy or otherwise, to embody these values and provide every group an equal opportunity at success. So, concluding everything together, uh, like implicit biases is not the problem we need to concern ourselves with. Yes, it is real, it may be real, it may have a correlation with behavior, but we should not sell these implicit bias trainings under the guise of research. We need to make policies, make social structures, or make laws that change how we behave, and how we behave will change how we think. So that is the main thing we are conveyed to by the author, and we need to hold ourselves accountable for it too, right? This is not something that's unconscious. This is something we are very conscious of while interacting with the people around us. So we need to hold ourselves accountable. We need to change how we behave. We need to work in a systematic manner rather than taking these workshops or trainings that may have a very, like very may create a superfluous image of us, right?